I'd like to introduce Carrol Peterson, who has portrayed Thomas Paine for us this evening. Carrol Peterson has a PhD in English from the University of Arkansas and is Professor Emeritus at Doane College, Nebraska. He traveled in summers from 1989 to 1997 with the Great Plains Chautauqua, where he first performed Thomas Paine, and he's also performed as Walt Whitman, Jack London, and James Thurber. He currently lives on Maryland's Eastern Shore. Now, would any of you like to ask Carrol Peterson questions about his research or other information about Thomas Paine?
Sounds like I'm schizophrenic, doesn't it?
During your research, was it common that Franklin would invite people from other countries here? And if so, did Tom Paine ever meet any of them?
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that. Does anyone else know whether Benjamin Franklin was in the habit of encouraging people to come to America while he was abroad? I didn't mention one thing that Tom Paine had to say about the execution of Louis XVI, and I should have, because it throws considerable light on him. He thought that not only was it wrong that they should execute Louis, but a much better idea would be to send him to America, where he said he might become a successful farmer. Paine didn't always have a very practical approach to things, I'm afraid, but I think he was right that they made a terrible mistake in executing the king, because I think it led to blood back and forth that was probably not at all necessary. I think it was the beginning of the disaster of the French Revolution. Yes?
Was Thomas Paine instrumental in suggesting the separation of church and state?
Good question. Was Thomas Paine instrumental in the idea of separation of church and state? I don't think he was in particular. There were a bunch of Virginians who were pretty strong on that issue. And one of the things that spurred it on was the Anglican Church, which had its roots in England. And they felt that this was another example, you see, of that kind of foreign interference. So I think it came more out of that than out of the kind of suspicion of the Christian church that you find in Paine, or probably even in Jefferson. Though there may have been a mingling of all that at the time, but I think it's rather the other. Yes?
I may be confusing this with someone else, but wasn't there, as a result of the writings on in the Age of Reason, something with a problem with the burial of Tom Paine?
Oh, excellent. Good question, because, yes, I always like to throw this in the question session one way or another. Tom Paine, when he returned to America in those later years, did not make many friends, and in fact seemed to keep acquiring enemies. He kept writing on religion. The one thing you have to say about this guy is that he didn't give up. So he kept offending people by what he had to say about Christianity. Finally, he settled on his farm in New Rochelle, New York. It was a farm that was given him by the New York legislature. And New York did more for him than the U.S. government did. He kept appealing for... This is one of the ironies of Paine. He kept appealing to the national government for a stipend, a kind of annual income from them, because he'd done so much for the revolution. And here's the guy who kept complaining about government, you know. Well, so anyway, he went back to this farm in New Rochelle, which had been given him by the New York legislature. It actually was a farm confiscated from a royalist. And he lived there for a time. He actually died in New York because he'd become very ill and had to be cared for, and he was in New York, and generally in what's now the Greenwich Village area. And I can't precisely locate it, but it's generally that part of New York. Then upon his death, he had asked, he knew he was failing badly in those last years, he had asked a group of Quakers if they would allow him to be buried in a Quaker cemetery, because in spite of all the nasty things he said about Quakers, as well as any other Christian group that he could, he had a lot of respect for Quakers. His father had been a Quaker, and he thought that they were in many ways right on matters of religious thinking. they said, well, we would like to be able to do this for you. However, you are so heartily disliked that we think that our cemetery will be desecrated if we do this. And so we have to say no. And so he was buried on his farm in New Rochelle. And only a few people there. I think 4 people at his funeral. And he rested there for 10 years, or his bones did. And then this William Cobbett, the guy who I quoted earlier as saying everything that is base, malicious, treacherous, unnatural, and blasphemous can be summed up in one word, Paine. Cobbett finally had read Thomas Paine instead of just parroting what he had heard others say about it, and he was converted. He decided this guy is somebody that needs to be respected. I'll add a little footnote here. There are some books by Thomas Paine available in the back, and I hope that some of you will pick them up. If you have not read Tom Paine, you ought to. He will stimulate you one way or the other. He's a marvelous writer. Well, anyway, Cobbett had read some of Thomas Paine and came to admire him so intensely, he said, we can't just leave this guy buried out on this farm out in rural New York. It was rural then. And so he somehow managed to get over from England. Cobbett was English. He got over, dug up the bones of Tom Paine. I don't know how he got the permission to do it or anything. He got them back to England. I don't know how that happened either. But there was William Cobbett in England with Tom Paine's bones. And he was going to build a great monument to this hero of freedom and revolutionary thinking. He ran out of money for it. He never did collect nearly enough. And he just kept the bones until he died. And you know what happens when people die and they don't have everything labeled as to who it belongs to. An auction was held, apparently, of the various possessions of William Cobbett. I am told that there are people who claim they have the skull of Tom Paine someplace, and others may have a finger bone or something, but I think it's probably like the relics of the saints. I don't think you should quite believe it. It's just a nice thing to be able to say. Nobody really knows where Tom Paine is. And since he called himself a citizen of the world, it's probably appropriate, you know? I'm not sure he'd be altogether unhappy at what's happened finally, you know. It maybe is better than being lost in some Quaker cemetery somewhere. Yeah.
How do you spell that word that has the system of the planets?
O-R-R-E-R, let's see, O-R-Y. I think there are 2 R's in the first case. And it may be just 1 R. O-R-E-R-Y maybe, but it's an orrery. Anybody know? Any English profs who are better English profs than I who can come up with that one? I saw one for sale once recently. They're kind of expensive today. Okay, maybe